Hey, welcome back to another week of the Idaho Outfitters and Guides Association podcast. I'm Eric Weissef.
And I'm Jack Hurdy.
Jack, you're back. You abandoned me. Had
I
to
know.
do podcasts with Aaron or by myself or whatever.
Yeah, sorry about that. But just really needed to get out of the country for 3 weeks. Yeah. Had a great time though. We were in Nepal. We did a little trekking, a little bit of rafting. It was cool to see how the rafting outfitters do it over there. Um, but it's good to be back. I'm excited to get back to work, do some
So
spring, summer boating.
that's awesome. I remember being over there doing a trip. We led this trip, Aaron and I, back in the day. And I just remember thinking, I'm going to send these guys NRS straps and totally like change their world. It was lots of rope and like
Yep.
rigging boats with just tie a knot. It was like, man, such a simple thing is so profound.
Yeah, we did a little overnighter, and I think there was one NRS strap on the whole trip.
Yeah. Yeah. I got a lot better at my knots in the week that we were there. Yeah, boating season is here, man. It's been fun. Been out doing some boating myself and enjoying it. And it seems like people are getting out there. Trips are starting. It's all getting going. So we did a
Yeah.
Hell's Canyon trip last week and saw a fair bit of jet boat traffic out there, people fishing and jet boating, and kind of tours seem to be starting up. So
Yeah.
exciting to
Yep.
have the spring arrive.
I know the lock saw has been going. I think people are trying to get after it earlier in the year this year.
Yeah, I think with early water, it's we're at almost 40,000, I think, in Riggins right now, at the Whitebird gauge, which I wouldn't be shocked if that's sort of near the top for the year, and it's happening now. So
Yeah.
if you like big water boating like I do, this may be the moment. Get out there and get some. So pretty cool. All right, should we hop into the updates here? So last week, Senator Bennett, along with Senators Merkley, Wyden, and Heinrich, introduced the Public Lands Integrity Act, a bill that would amend the congressional budget process to require 60 votes in the Senate for public land sales. So this essentially would have prevented the Mike Lee movement from trying to do what he did last year during reconciliation and allowing for a push through of public land sales on just a party line vote in the Senate. IOGA, we worked with Senator Bennett's office along with America Outdoors on some concepts around this early and is something that we think has great potential to block a path towards public land sales and really just move those over to the normal process as a way to do things. So
Yep. It seems like a good concept with a lot of upside, kind of a technical fix that has a big impact. Yeah. In other good news, we just got some word that Idaho Senator Jim Risch is moving to support the America the Beautiful Act. So this is a bill that's kind of been floating around for a little while, and it would reauthorize and then increase funding for the Legacy Restoration Fund. So this is a pot of money that was created in 2020 as part of the Great America Outdoors Act, and it goes primarily to fund recreation infrastructure. So it goes all over the country, but in Idaho, it's been used to maintain and restore parts of the Hiawatha Trail, trails around Redfish Lake, and just to tackle deferred maintenance, a lot of the rec sites statewide. We're pretty optimistic about this bill. We hope that it can get some momentum and pass, and we really think it can bring in some good resources to benefit outfitters.
yeah, at a time when we're talking a lot about trail maintenance, this is
Yeah.
this is a really nice thing to see. Just more funds and resources to get this done.
Yep. Other news regarding recreation on public lands. Yesterday, the BLM officially rescinded the Landscape Health and Conservation Rule, also known as the Public Lands Rule. So we talked about this on the podcast before. We've got a blog post on the IOGA website about it. This rule was finalized in May of 2024, so towards the end of the Biden administration, with the goal to kind of streamline and promote conservation on BLM lands. So there's been a lot of rhetoric about this from people that support it and oppose it. In my read of it, the rule itself was not an earth-shattering change to public land management. It was trying to accomplish a couple things. The first was to align management standards across landscapes and BLM units to kind of create some new regulatory frameworks to do conservation on BLM land. And then the one thing that people were very worked up about was that it created the possibility for conservation leases on public lands, BLM lands. There are people that were concerned that this would be used as a tool to lock out other uses, but if you actually went and looked at how it was written such that conservation uses could not interfere with other existing uses, whether grazing, energy development, or recreation. It probably would have helped in some places to get more conservation dollars from nonprofits and private individuals on the ground. I don't think it would have had a huge impact on the way our public lands are managed. On the other hand, repealing the rule, I've seen some people claiming that this is taking the public out of public lands. I've also seen some people claiming that it'll be returning the BLM to this golden era of grazing and mining. We got to remember the rule's only been in place since May of 2024. The BLM has barely implemented it in any meaningful way, and I don't think they had really done much in Idaho at all. So, when we're talking about this, we should remember that the repeal of this rule is taking us back to the status quo of April 2024, which really isn't that big of a change. The other thing to watch out for, whenever you kind of get this seesawing in regulatory action, it makes it more uncertain for businesses like outfitters. I think it also makes it more likely that, the next administration could come back and reinstate this rule in a stronger and potentially less balanced form. So our perspective on the rule when they moved to rescind it was that a better move would be to adjust it and kind of tweak some of the things that people were upset about. But the BLM went whole hog and took it out. So, that's kind of where we're at on that. We'll see where it ends up over the next few years.
Yeah. There's some people who it's sort of the end of the world. And as you said, it takes us back to the glory days of 2024. But it does take some tools out of the toolbox that could have been handy, but it is what it is. I think you're right. The bigger issue in the long term is going to be the potential for more seesaw effect on this. So I'll be curious to see where it goes. In other BLM related news, Steve Pierce moves closer to confirmation for BLM director. His confirmation is expected early next week, according to Majority Leader Thune's office. It seemed like it was going to happen sooner, but I think some rules and process maybe modified or something. And there was a vote to move that forward. I think it was yesterday. And Senator Risch abstained from the vote, which is notable, giving his sort of aggressive line of questioning during the committee hearings and his very public stance on being pro public lands and some of the baggage that comes with Steve Pierce related to that specific topic. So in the long term, we expect Risch will probably vote to confirm Pierce, but it is kind of an awkward vote for him based on Pierce's past movements and claims and everything else. And, the aggressive question that he gave. But that we would expect to happen next week. In final news this week, Tammy Overacker was reappointed to the Idaho Outfitters and Guides Licensing Board under the Department of Professional Licenses. So I believe she is starting her second term on the board and is actually going to serve as the board chair with Brad Compton stepping down. So excited to see Tammy reappointed by the governor. She is an amazing asset to outfitters on that board and brings a lot of wisdom, experience, and just, I think, good judgment to that group. So excited to see Tammy back. IOGA relies on the support of our members and specifically our Dollars for Outdoors supporters who go above and beyond. Supporters like Cascade Raft and Kayak, Mile High Outfitters, McGowan Outfitters, White Cloud Outfitters, Bear Valley, Rapid River Outfitters, Soar Northwest, Bighorn Outfitting, Mystic Saddle, and Table Mountain. Also, our Dollars for Salmon supporters, where their money goes specifically to support our work advocating for anadromous fish recovery, Rapid River Outfitters, S&S, Canyons, Solitude, and Salmon River Drifters. Thank all of you for your support of IOGA and the work that we're doing. All right, upcoming IOGA announcements. IOGA will be at the Rendezvous in Salmon this coming weekend. Come on by, chat with us, get some swag, and let us know of ideas for the podcast in the future. Jack, aren't you giving a presentation at the rendezvous this weekend?
I am not. Mark Martin will be preaching the salmon gospel, though, which has been one of my passion topics. So I'll definitely be there to support Mark and maybe add in a few comments of my own at the end.
Awesome. Yeah. Well, the IOGA crew will be there. We'll be over at our table. If you're a guide, you want to come talk about what IOGA does, we'll have the ability to sign you up for membership and get feedback on things we're working on, and also connect you with ways that you can engage and participate with the organization in advocating for the industry, doing our work on public lands or fish recovery and all those kinds of things. So come by and say hi. We have another event coming up that is one of my favorites of the year, as someone who spent a lot of time in Riggins. Big water blowouts coming up first weekend in June. It's heck of a good time. Not sure it's going to be the biggest of big water this year, but it'll still be bigger than it will be the rest of the year. So should be a good time. You been, Jack?
A couple times. Yeah. Mostly just working for IOGA.
Dutch oven cook-off and this guide party and all of it. It's a great time. So if you haven't been, make sure you show up.
Yeah. It's definitely a blowout regardless of water.
Yeah, big time. And then final thing is membership renewals are coming up July 1st. So IOGA renewals are July 1. So if you want to renew your membership, start getting ready. We'll be sending things out as that gets closer. Now to the interview for the week.
All right. Well, today I get the pleasure of putting Erik in the hot seat and asking him questions and getting some answers. So we'll be tackling a maybe potentially controversial move from the Forest Service, one that IOGA and a lot of our outfitter members in the Frank Church have been pushing for a while. I'm talking, of course, about the authorization went out this morning, allowing limited use of chainsaws to clear trail on the eastern side of the Frank, the part of the Frank that's administered by the Salmon-Challis. Obviously, there's quite a lot to this. It's kind of a complicated issue. So we'll do our best to kind of walk through it and hopefully answer your questions, your concerns in the process. So first off, Erik, can you give us a bit of the background on this? You know, the history and kind of how this process got going?
Yeah, absolutely. Being a river-based outfitter, this wasn't something for, the last couple of decades. This wasn't something that was super front and center for me, as far as like kind of the trail maintenance backlog that's happening. But serving on the board of IOGA for the last 10 years or so, I think it was something that just kind of I constantly heard a lot about from the land-based outfitters, more and more of this being an issue, and just kind of like growing over time, becoming bigger and bigger problem. And then serving on the licensing board, we certainly heard about it there with people submitting hardship requests related to tags and all sorts of stuff, and the ways that they simply couldn't even access um, their operating areas because there was thousands of trees across their trails. And, there was varying amounts of sympathy for that on the board, certainly. But it just brought the issue kind of front and center to me. And one of the things that I think Aaron, who was in the role of executive director before me, was kind of involved in those conversations for a long time and had some past IOGA members kind of do homework on the legal foundations for chainsaw use in wilderness, where the concepts came from, and sort of the underlying background on required trail maintenance, tools that can be allowed, all of that kind of stuff. And back in May, Aaron sent a letter to the chief of the Forest Service, basically laying out the argument that the Frank is in crisis from a trail maintenance standpoint. There are trails that are just inaccessible, have been inaccessible for a decade, will probably never be accessible again, and will just simply disappear if we don't do something different than what we're doing. And then he laid out the legal argument based on the Central Idaho Wilderness Act, the supporting documentation, the congressional record that went along with the act, as well as some other things, that this is legal. The use of chainsaws to go clear this backlog is not only legal, it's arguably maybe even required, and that it's the right thing to do. And so the chief or the Forest Service basically got back and instructed IOGA to work with the Salmon-Challis office on putting together something that would, or basically have them work with us so we could put together a more detailed proposal. we were able to get GIS information from them, and this is about the time I came in to this equation. I was able to get GIS information from them, overlaying all the trails that they manage in the Frank with fire damage and beetle kill damage from the last 20 years. And that 20 years number is, there's kind of some story to why we chose that, but over the last 20 years. And we looked at how many trail miles out of the roughly 1,200 trail miles or something that there is in the Frank that's overseen by the Salmon-Challis, and kind of started looking at, okay, how much of each trail is in these fire and beetle kill zones. And we're talking about the level of fire, the level of beetle kill is something that you haven't historically seen since like the Wilderness Act, certainly since Central Idaho Wilderness Act. Like, we have seen a growing amount of that damage. Like, this isn't comparable to just sort of the natural falling of trees in the woods. This is something that's different. And we came up with some equations looking at the different types of trails and how much of each of those trails has been in one of these zones that was unique amounts of fire or beetle kill damage. So in the Frank, in the management plan, there's 3 types of trails: like mainline trails, secondary trails, and I think they call them way trails, which is like that third tier of trail. And your main line is kind of that main artery that maybe is 20 or 30 miles. Your secondaries are shorter, sort of middle range ones that usually fork off of your main trails, and your way trails are like those last little guys that go off to that last little bit. And we came up with a way of looking at this that said, okay, the mainline trails, because they're super long, less of those trails needs to be in these fire damage zones to qualify for clearing out. Because the reality is, you could have a 40-mile trail, and if the first 5 miles are totally destroyed by fire and beetle kill, the last 35 miles is pointless because you can't get there. So, smaller percentage. I think we said around 40% of those. If 40% of one of these mainline trails has been in a fire or beetle kill zone, that should qualify. And then your next tier, those mid-level trails, and also I think it's worth saying, those trails, according to the management plan, those main lines, are required by law to be logged out every year. And they're not being. Those secondary trails, which are supposed to be logged out, I think, every 3 to 5 or 2 to 5 years, we said, I think it was somewhere in the neighborhood of like 65% of those trails need to have been within this fire beetle kill zone. And then when you get to those third tier ones, which are typically quite a bit shorter, and in the management plan themselves are specifically said to be like maintained to a lighter standard, more natural, we said those trails have to be like 95 or 90% within a fire beetle kill zone to qualify for this. So we started running these numbers, and when you do that, it turns out that about 44% of all the trails in the Frank would qualify. You know, it's over 500 miles of trail, 61 trails, I think, would qualify for use of chainsaws to go clear these. And that is a lot of trail miles, but it also is kind of guardrails, right? We didn't want this to be big and open. We didn't want to open it up for chainsaws. I mean, I think the legal record is clear that you probably can use chainsaws to go do this everywhere. But I think that people's sort of slippery slope fear on this is legitimate, and we really felt like this should be targeted towards clearing this backlog of work. So we put this proposal forward to the Forest Service saying, you know, hey, these trails that are identified through these sort of calculations or reasons, that we think you could do it in a 3-year window, and we think that, you know, you need chainsaws to do it. The Forest Service then went and did what is their legal process, which is a minimum requirements analysis, MRA. And they went through that whole process. You could go find the form online. Like, they lay out their arguments, they lay out the problem that they're seeing, they go through 3 different possible solutions to the problem. So here's this problem: these trails that are going to disappear that have this crazy amount of backlog. How do we clear them out? Meeting our legal obligation to do so. And they looked at hand tools and decided that the backlog is just too great. There is no realistic future where they're going to have the resources to clear those trails with hand tools. They looked at electric chainsaws and came to the determination that while that technology has come a long way and it's pretty cool, that the battery life is still too short and the recharging technology is still kind of unproven enough for that to be a viable backcountry solution. And so they just determined that that probably is not the minimum required tool. And then gas chainsaws, which have a proven track record. We know they work in places like this. We know they'll do the work. And that was determined, I think, as the minimum tool required.
Okay, so
So,
I
yeah,
wanna go back to this MRA thing because I think that's something people aren't really familiar with. And that's something that comes out of the Wilderness Act itself, right? That's kind of what the
yes,
Wilderness Act, the original 1964, requires.
yes.
And you've touched on the legal argument a few times, but I want to go through that just a little bit so we can kind of cover that for folks because I've definitely thought this myself for a long time, and I know some of my friends think this, and other people on social media think this. The wilderness doesn't prohibit motorized equipment or mechanized equipment 100%, right? There's ways to use it. Can you talk about that process?
Yeah, it's not prohibited outright, right? There is a process within the Wilderness Act where I think they recognize that in the future you may have to use certain tools or things that were not envisioned in when the act was created and everything else. And so they created this tool, the minimum requirements analysis, and it's a process that you go through essentially to say, hey, here's a problem we need to solve. What is the way that we do it with the least amount of impact, where we violate the wilderness principle the least? Not to say we don't, it is minimum, right? And so that is the process they went through in this case. They said, we have this problem. We have a legal obligation to clear these trails. What is the tool or mechanism or method that is the least impactful?
And that legal obligation to clear trails, that comes from the Franks originating legislation, right? The
Correct.
Central Idaho Wilderness Act. So
Yeah,
this is almost a unique thing to the Frank in that, Congress was requiring the Forest Service to have those trails cleared, and they also left, this option in the Wilderness Act to use this tool when it's determined to be the minimum required tool necessary. Is
correct. So I
that
would
is
go,
that correct? Yeah.
yeah, kind of. The argument that we're making, the proposal that we're making, is unique to the Frank. It is part of the argument and why we think that it's justified is the language in the Central Idaho Wilderness Act, which I'll get to. But it kind of backs up a little bit further. So you have the Wilderness Act in 64. Then in 1978, you have the Endangered American Wilderness Act, which creates a bunch more wilderness areas, ones that I have a very personal affinity for, like the Kalamiopsis and the Mount Hood and the Rogue and all these others. And in the House report that accompanies that act, and from doing some reading about it, it seems like they were trying to figure out, the Wilderness Act kind of creates this ideal, but then like real practical questions start coming up. And around like, okay, we have this wilderness ideal. Well, can you have signs in the wilderness then? Because that's like, you know, the sign being there does impact the sort of wilderness view or the wilderness perspective. It is no longer untrammeled if there's a sign, right? Same thing with a bridge. Can you have a bridge across a creek? And the House
Can you
report that
have a jet
accompanies,
boat? Can you have a airplane?
well, that's a almost a more interesting question because that gets you uh, more into the Central Idaho Wilderness Act specifically because of some of the things that already existed there. But the record that goes along with that Endangered American Wilderness Act essentially says, you know, trail signs, trails, bridges are all permissible when designed in keeping with the wilderness concept. They're important for recreational access and the use of a wilderness area. And then it actually says trail construction or maintenance can include the use of mechanical equipment. So that's before you even get to the Central Idaho Wilderness Act. Here you have an accompanying report from Congress saying that they understand that sometimes you need to use mechanical tools for maintenance of trails. So then you get to the Central Idaho Wilderness Act, 1980, the act that actually creates the Frank. And in that act, the language in the act says, the secretary shall, to the maximum extent practical, consistent with the management plan required by this section, clear obstructions from all national forest trails within or adjacent to the wilderness on at least an annual basis. And as you go into the actual management plan, that's where you get into those kind of three different variations of trails, with the main lines being required to clear every year, your secondaries every, I think, 3 to 5 or 2 to 5, and your way trails more rarely. But that legal obligation is still there. And then in the congressional record, the report that goes along with the passing of that act in 1980, the committee that worked on this has kind of a footnote in there, specifically in that part where it talks about requiring the secretary to have these trails cleared every year. And it says the committee recognizes this is a relatively large task and observes that the secretary can contract with outfitters and other third parties to perform such work. The committee has no objection to the use of chainsaws or other mechanized tools to perform such tasks, as long as such uses occur in seasons and areas of use where such equipment will not adversely affect wildlife utilization, disrupt natural process succession, or create unnecessary conflict with primitive recreational use.
And that's referring directly to the Frank.
That is the report that went along with the Central Idaho Wilderness Act, specifically a footnote to the requirement in the act that the trails are cleared every year. So it is very specific to the Frank.
So that, in my mind, that, the law seems pretty clear. The legislative history seems pretty clear. That's really helpful to have that background. I kind of interrupted you. You were talking about the different trails. What is the scope of this problem? Can you lay out the scope of the deadfall issue and, kind of a grand scale here?
So we had this hypothesis. I mean, essentially it was a hypothesis, right? That trails that had been within this last 20 years that had significant portions of that trail in these fire zones or beetle kill zones were going to have abnormal amounts of deadfall on them, right? And so back in October, the Forest Service decided to hop in a helicopter and fly out over the trails that we had highlighted to essentially try and verify if that hypothesis is true and count how many trees are across and whatever else. So they flew about 150. Yeah, exactly. Right. So they flew about 150 miles of the trails of the 540 some odd miles that we identified. In that 150 miles alone, they counted somewhere between 80 and 110,000 trees over trails. That's 500 to 700 trees per mile across these trails. And so, one, it's reasonable to assume that the other 300 and some odd miles that we identified are going to be similar. But then I think the thing that was, to me, more profound was that they then flew over one ridge line over and looked at some trails that we didn't identify. And they were counting 10 trees, 20 trees per mile. Something way more normal. So it really highlighted this is what normal sort of tree fall on a trail looks like, and that's manageable with hand tools and everything else. And this is what is a result of kind of our modern times that we're in, where we're having these unique, damaging events in the forest. Right? Like there is a difference.
Yeah. So your analysis based on fire history and insect and disease damage seemed to be fairly spot on based on that.
It does.
Aerial recon.
Yeah. And I think the other thing that was interesting to me as I was going through this process and kind of learning, and I don't remember the exact year on this, but doing some reading about it and talking with folks, I would have assumed that, fire happens this year. Like the majority of the downfall from that fire is going to be like that year or maybe 1 year out, sometime in the next like 24 months. And apparently that is not correct. It's way further down the road. Your maximum tree fall from those events is like 13, 14, 15 years down the road. So that's why we looked 20 years back, was to try and encapsulate all that, because what happens now, the impacts of that are often felt more than a decade down the road.
Yeah. And this isn't a new problem. Like these are, like you said, fires that happened 20 years ago. So what has the Forest Service been doing in the meantime to try to deal with this problem? Like what is the status quo of trail maintenance in that part of the Frank right now?
I mean, I think they're doing the best they can with what they got. You look back, like certainly when the Wilderness Act happened and then the Central Idaho Wilderness Act, I mean, trail crews on some of these forests were 30, 40 people, like staff. Now they're like 3, 4. And, they do a lot of contract work. There's a lot of really good groups doing trail work. There's a lot of outfitters doing good trail work, but it still is under-resourced, for the problem. There was some money came in back in 2016. What was that? We were just talking about this, the Great American, no.
Trail Stewardship Act?
Well, GOA money. Like there
Yeah.
was money that came in for doing this and that helped. Like South Frank got some more money. They bumped it up. They were able to hire more contractors and everything else. Cool. Like so you clear a little bit more of some of these main trails, but the trails that you're not clearing are just getting worse. I mean, shoot, I was just reading a report yesterday from one of these groups that does a lot of great trail work, and they were flying back into the Frank to re-clear 3 miles of trail that they cleared last year to hopefully get to be able to maybe clear another mile or two up some trail.
Yeah.
It's just like the problem is just keeps it. You clear it, it doesn't mean it's going to stay cleared. You're going to have to go back and
Yeah.
re-clear that before you ever get back to the stuff you haven't cleared yet at all, which has gotten worse since you weren't there.
Yeah. My mom actually volunteers with the Idaho Trails Association, and she's gone on a number of these trips inside the Frank and outside, where they are clearing trail along a certain section and hiking as they go. And then on the last day, they hike back out. And she was telling me about a trip she did last year where they cleared all this trail into this lake. And then on the way back out, there was a windstorm on like the last night. On the way back out, they had to recut a bunch of the trail that they had just cleared.
Cut their way back out.
Pretty
Yeah.
much, yeah.
Yeah,
So,
it's not, you don't just solve it and the problem goes away, which I think makes this, long-term wise an interesting conversation. But if we don't deal with the backlog, we'll never get to have the other conversation about what ongoing maintenance looks like.
yeah. All right. So to get back on track, you put all this information together. You sent a letter to the chief. The chief asked you to work with the Salmon-Challis. Salmon-Challis flew out, looked at the trees, and then they started their minimum requirements analysis. And they looked at hand tools, electric saws, and gas saws, concluded that gas saws were really the only effective tool to solve this problem.
Viable
So where does
tool.
that viable tool, where does that leave us now? What's happening right
So
now?
the Forest Service kind of went through their whole process. We basically submitted the request and said, hey, we think this is the solution. You guys should consider this. They, to their credit, like did their due diligence, went through their process. And today is Wednesday, the 13th. The MRA was signed, I think, this morning, and authorization letters were sent out to outfitters to basically authorizing them to be able to get to work using saws. I mean, these guys are already authorized to go clear their trails, and all of them already work with the Forest Service through the fee offset program, the Trail Stewardship Act. So they all have kind of experience in this space. But historically, when they're in wilderness, it's been using hand tools, and they were authorized to be able to use chainsaws under this MRA for this 3-year period.
So the only people
So,
that are using chainsaws are kind of these Forest Service contractors or Forest Service crews, correct?
so it's contractors in the sense that, I mean, I don't think outfitters under the Trail Stewardship Act technically qualify as contractors, but yes, right? Like we're permittees or whatever. Uncle Buck can't grab his saw and just go out there and start cutting. It's going to be people that are authorized. So that's going to be volunteer crews potentially, I think. Contractors, whatever, but you're going to have some formal relationship with the Forest Service.
Gotcha. So it's
Yeah,
not
yeah,
just,
yeah.
not just anyone off the street.
Correct.
What other limitations are there for this authorization? My understanding of it is it's actually fairly narrow, but I think we should go through kind of the shape of it.
It is. It's these specific trails and only these specific trails. It is only from Jan 1 to August 1 every year. So really trying to avoid that peak season. So coming from the riverside, that sounds funny to me to think like July is in here. But the reality is in the backcountry of the Frank, peak season is hunting season. And we wanted to try and limit that impact as much as possible on people experiencing wilderness. But the season needed to go late enough that you can actually access some of these trails. Some of these trails you can't even access on a typical snow year until early to middle of
Right.
July because of
Yeah,
snow.
so it's really like June maybe to August 1st. I don't think
Yeah,
anyone's clearing trail in February.
in a lot of them. Yeah, that's right. Yeah, or maybe May in some of the really low spots. But yes, you're right. For the most part, it's like May, June, and July. People are out doing this, and so it up to August 1st on these specific trails by these specific people for a proposed 3-year window.
Okay. And then
Yeah,
after
so
3
that's the
years,
guardrails, and it's just the Frank, and it's just the Frank and the
just
Salmon-Challis, right?
yeah.
Like,
So after 3 summers of this, we go back and we look again and probably do another MRA, I would imagine, to reevaluate the conditions of the trails and decide based on that how to handle it going forward. Correct?
I mean, I think, as folks work, they'll be tracking the work that they're doing. We'll see what kind of impact is made, how many miles get cleared, and then there'll be the opportunity to evaluate how many more miles got cleared this way. And, does this need to be part of the tool belt going forward so we don't end up in the same place? I don't know. Like, I would love to live in a world where the Forest Service is funded enough that they can send folks out there with crosscuts and, get this work done. I don't see a whole lot changing in that space for the foreseeable future. And so I wouldn't be shocked if this is ultimately determined to be a tool that, needs to stay in the tool belt for the future. But that's a decision for somebody far above my pay grade and everything else.
Yeah.
We'll be here advocating for what we think is best for the resource and, best for kind of outfitters and access and the general public. But I don't
Right.
know.
And I think best case scenario, is we can clear some of these trails that are catastrophically blocked and get, those areas back to a manageable baseline where, hand tools and crews operating on the regular system makes sense to keep it going. We don't need to go back to chainsaws unless and until there's another catastrophic deadfall event.
That's, I think, exactly right. Like that, to me, if I was to look at this, that's my goal is to just get back to that baseline. And the reality is, like chainsaws don't fully solve the problem. You still have brushing that still needs to happen. You still have tread work that still needs to happen. You still have rocks that got to be moved off trails that still needs to happen. Chainsaws are just like clearing trees is just one portion of this bigger trail maintenance effort. But if you can speed up that portion, it gives more time to do the other things as well.
Yeah. Okay. Well, I want to run through some of the concerns we've heard about this because I think some of them are worth addressing, and I also want to get you a chance to respond to them. So, the first one, and maybe the obvious one, and some criticism has come through basically saying that this is just outfitters looking out for their commercial interests. That this is all about the money, and it's just about keeping the business running. What do you say to that?
I mean, we're a business trade association. So, like, obviously, the work that we do has some sort of correlation to our members and their jobs and everything else. Great. That doesn't change the fact that the average general public also uses these trails or would use them if they're open. Like, this is a public access issue. We as an association spend a lot of time and effort advocating for public lands, advocating for uh, public lands staying in public hands. I mean, like we are very much involved in public lands advocacy conversations all the time. This is just another component of that. Access matters. If we keep all the public lands in public hands, but there's no way to access them, that's no different than if they all get sold off and go away. Right? We have to be able to access these public lands for them to matter to us and for there to be a constituency in the future that will do the work that we're doing today protecting them. So, yes, clearing trails is about our businesses and our members, but it is very much also about serving the public and making sure that we have a community in the future who has experiences in these places to have the emotional connection to do the work to advocate for them.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that's a good thing to remember is that these trails being open benefits everybody, whether you're an outfitter or a guide that's trying to do your job, or if you're just a guy that wants to go on a backpacking trip. Um, so yeah, real public benefit. I also think, there's a real value add to having outfitters doing this work. They're really tough, smart people that are good at solving problems in the backcountry. And that's a skill that is less and less common these days. Um, and in many ways, these are the best and the brightest of wilderness trail maintenance going out there and getting it done.
Well, and we
Alongside
have the
the
tools, we have the stock.
yeah,
The Forest Service, I mean, Salmon-Challis, I think, is one of the few Forest Service offices left that actually has like their own stock and has the horses to get back to places like this for their 3 trail people or whatever they have, you know. But outfitters, we have the tools to access these deep in the woods places.
yeah. Um, Another concern. What do you think about the possibility that this sets a precedent for chainsaw use in the broader wilderness preservation system?
I mean, maybe, like, I don't know. Our proposal is very narrowly written to the frank under the uh, legislative language and the legislation that created the frank. So our arguments don't really hold up directly across to any other wilderness area outside of the frank. So I don't think it sets that precedent. I'm not a lawyer. I don't know. All I know is we had our problem here and we did the homework and we felt like there's a solution and we're pursuing that solution here. If someone wants to take that and run with it somewhere else, that's really on them, not on me.
Yeah, and I think we talked a bit about the Central Idaho Wilderness Act and the language in there. That is unique language. I can't say it doesn't exist for other places, but it is, specifically written for the Franks. So there is a little bit of a difference in kind in that respect.
Well, the
Um,
Frank's just different. I mean, how many other wilderness areas do you have where you got a bunch of jet boats running around or airplanes landing in and out or a bunch of like lived in still homesteads and everything else? Like it's just the Frank is different,
it is.
period.
Yeah, and if anyone that's spent time out there can tell you that. Um, the last question, you know, I think there's a broader wilderness value conversation here, and there's definitely some people I think that feel that chainsaws in wilderness are just fundamentally opposed to kind of the wilderness values, regardless of the legality of it, regardless of what it means for trail maintenance or people's businesses or jobs. That it's just a red line that shouldn't be crossed from a value perspective. What's your thought on that?
I listen to a podcast where one of the podcast guy says this all the time about a certain demographic of people. He's like, you can either be effective or you can be right, or you could be right or you could be effective. And I think this to me is one of those moments where I get it. I appreciate the argument. I wish we weren't in a situation, where necessarily we had to do this because I do think it raises some interesting questions around the wilderness ethic and everything else. Like, I think that's a fascinating conversation. But I'm also like morally opposed to not solving this problem because I think the bigger wilderness value is access. I care that this wilderness still exists 50 years from now. I care that this wilderness still exists 100 years from now. And if we hand down a wilderness area to the next generation that they can't access, they will not be advocates for it. And I think it goes further. Like, they also will not be advocates for the Forest Service. The Forest Service, I was an outfitter a long time. I've operated under a lot of Forest Service permits. I've been in this role or related to it for a long time. I have had my disagreements with the Forest Service, 100%. I still very much value that organization. I value the work they do. I value the protection that they provide to these to places like the Frank. I want them to be a successful organization. And if family after family after person goes out to a trailhead, walks a half mile, and then gets stopped by 10,000 trees, that person is neither going to be an advocate for the wilderness area, but even more so, they're not going to be an advocate for the Forest Service. Like, people talk about, you hear this argument that like, oh, they're going to underfund these organizations so they can't get their jobs done. And then they're going to use that as an excuse to get rid of them because they can't get their jobs done. Well, this is one of the greatest examples of that, I think. And we have an opportunity to do something. like to help open up these trails so that there can be more advocates both for the wilderness and hopefully the organization that has to manage it.
Yeah. I think if there's one lesson I've learned from the last couple of years working in kind of the conservation public land space is that there's a real political cost to failing to solve problems. Even if you can uphold an abstract value, you pay a real price, and it comes around to bite you in the ass. I think, yeah, preserving that access, solving a real problem for people on the ground, and preserving, the wilderness value of pristine, primitive opportunities for primitive and unconfined recreation and solitude. That's a real thing that's at stake here, and not clearing those trails damages that value.
Big time.
Big time.
Yeah, I mean, if you think about it, like if you have, say, 30 trails to access the wilderness, and now 25 of them are clogged with trees and you can't get out there, and so all that same number of people are now confined to 5 trails, isolation just went away. Impact to that resource just increased drastically because you have everybody going on this one trail. So that specific trail and that resource is going to have negative impact because of that increased level of traffic. Or the other one that was interesting to me as we did the homework on this is you're hiking along, you come across a tree that you don't want to climb across, can't climb across, you're on stock, whatever. What do? You go around it. You go off of the existing tread and start creating new tread. You actually degrade the resource by creating unbuilt trails. So it actually impacts the resource negatively. What's best for the resource is for these trails to be cleared. So it allows for better isolation, it allows to spread out the traffic, and it allows people to stay on the trail and not degrade the resource. This is about preservation for these places. You're maintaining, we went in and built the trails. Let's keep the things that we went in and built. We did the hard work already. This is just cutting trees.
Well said. All right. Well, that seems like a pretty good place to wrap it up. Is there anything else you want to say about this that I didn't ask you about?
I think I am incredibly sympathetic to the people who are uncomfortable with this. When I kind of like I said, I've been around this issue for a long time, but the actual effort was started by my predecessor on this, and I kind of walked into it. And it at first made me relatively uncomfortable. I'm into solving problems and I'm still passionate about all the other pieces I believe, and I've learned a lot about it since then. But I get the discomfort. But the more I've looked at this and the deeper I've gotten into it, the more that I think not solving this problem is worse for the resource in the long term. And so I think we need to do this. I think there's the legal piece, which is a whole separate thing, but the sort of bigger emotional, social, philosophical piece, that's the piece that I've been a little uncomfortable with. But I think as someone who's passionate about this wilderness, this is the best way to protect it.
All right. Erik Weisseth, thanks for coming on the podcast, man.
Happy to be here. Thanks for having me.
Good having you. Yeah. All right, folks, that's our interview for today. Thank you, Erik Weisseth from the Idaho Outfitters and Guides Association, for coming on here to chat with us. And thanks again to all the outfitters and guides in Idaho who are out there in the field, working hard, getting ready for the river season, clearing trails, and just doing their best to share the incredible experiences that our state has to offer with people that otherwise would never have a chance to do it. Access and experience with the natural world is what drives people to become advocates for them. So you guys you're doing great work out there. If you enjoyed this episode, if you learned something, subscribe, send it to your guide crews. But most importantly, please consider joining the IOGA as a member, whether you're an outfitter, a guide, business associate. We might even have a membership for the general public coming soon. It's the support from you all in the community that allows us to kind of continue these efforts, advocating for our community, being a source of information, and just having jobs. So we'll see you all next week or whenever we get the next podcast out. But thanks for listening.